Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Great Dynamics podcast. My name is Ahmed Hassan, and today, special for Sahel Security Week, we have the one and only Héni Nsaibia. Héni is the man behind the very popular Menastream. I would say probably one of the most knowledgeable people online on the Sahel, and in particular Burkina Faso. Héni is also a senior researcher at ACLED, and he does some other projects that he might or might not go into in a bit. And he's a friend. And Héni, welcome to the Great Dynamics podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So Héni, as I said, this is a special podcast. We're doing a whole week on Sahel security, and I wanted to go into it with you. But first of all, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, on what the origin is from the Menastream and how you got where you are today?
Yeah, first of all, Ahmed, thank you for the invitation. My name is Héni Nsaibia. I'm the director of Menastream. Yeah, Menastream is a research consultancy focusing on the North Africa and the Sahel region, or West Africa more broadly. We have special niche on conflict, political violence, and security and military affairs, and provide bespoke services to a range of clients, including international organizations, government agencies, and other consultancy firms. Yeah, and I mean, to provide a little bit of background on how I began to work in this domain, it's a quite long story. I'm a football player at the base, so to speak. I was a youth elite football player, but my career ended quite abruptly due to a very serious injury. So I went through 2 surgeries and never really recovered, which kind of changed the trajectory of, what I intended to do in my life. And due to the blood, sweat, and tears invested over the course of my childhood and youth, I really, fell behind with my studies. So I reached adulthood. I began to work in various branches. But in any case, at some point, I didn't find any of the stuff that I did very stimulating. So at the age of 25, I really decided to kind of reschool myself and take up my studies, which I did. And eventually I joined the Middle East and North Africa studies program at Stockholm University, because I really had an interest in, international relations, politics, and other, topics like geography, religion, and basically also due to my own origins as a Tunisian and Algerian by descent. So I always had quite strong connections to North Africa and also Middle East due to, personal connection and kinship ties. And on that road, re-educating myself and try to find, a different kind of path in my life and do something that I was really interested in, it kind of planted the seed and the idea of what I wanted to do in the near future. At the same time, starting, re-educating yourself at a later stage in your life also have some limitations, because, I'm based in Sweden, and, the domain which I'm currently in, it's very kind of limited. So, I mean, you could possibly aim to get a post as a diplomat or something, but, it becomes very difficult if you have reached a certain age. So for that reason, I started out small, beginning on Twitter, basically. So this is kind of the unfiltered story about, how it all began. So, I mean, initially it was just like a hobby. I reposted stuff that I read related to, things that were happening in the Middle East and so on.
When did the Menastream start?
I mean, the Twitter account was in 2015.
Okay.
So it's not that long ago, but I started my, studies way before that. So it was quite a process, because I had a son during the time and a little hiatus with my studies as well. But I mean, I started the Twitter account in 2015, and initially it was very kind of hobby-like, just my general interest, trying out this application and, following stuff that was happening, throughout the world, and especially in the broader MENA region. That's why I chose the name Menastream, because, I mean, as I said, it began with a very kind of rough idea of developing some kind of trademark, and, on that way, it has evolved, I mean, over all expectations.
Yeah.
So to begin with, it was, as I said, very random, just posting stuff, reading stuff, and following what other people do, like think tanks and just news in general. But at the same time, as I said, I had a quite strong connection. And at one point in 2010, I traveled to Tunisia with my wife and my eldest son to just try and see how it was to live there, and, just try it out. And also to let my son, see country of his, grandparents and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But after a while, I kind of explored ideas of, staying there and living there for a longer period of time, and also seeing what opportunities there were for doing business. But at this time, I really didn't have an idea about, working in this domain that I'm currently in. It was more like maybe starting a gym or, doing whatever kind of business that could, subsist a way of living in the country. But at the same time, the bureaucracy and, adapting to a completely different system, it has some challenges. And, at one point, we decided it's time to go home and make some more money and possibly return in the nearby future.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, that didn't happen. But instead, the Arab Spring or the Arab uprising were triggered in Tunisia. So because of that, it was like this wave of protests that, spread across the whole region. At the same time, I was reminded that I always had this frustration that, information coming from the Maghreb countries was always quite limited. It was mostly Arabic and, French language news, but very kind of censored and filtered. So you didn't really get that kind of in-depth that you were looking for, especially related to certain sensitive topics like, terrorism and militancy and security matters, because at the time of the former President Ben Ali, the country was quite closed in that regard, even though it is really a tourism country. But still, when it comes to things that are sensitive and happening on the ground, there was very little to find. But that changed with the Arab Spring. And there were even some outlets that were, English language, like Tunisia Live, for instance, which became quite popular and did some interesting work to provide a greater public with insight on matters related to Tunisia. And I kind of had a similar idea to create some form of translation service, from French to Arabic into English, and post it as some kind of blog. But in the wake of the Arab Spring also came a lot of things related to terrorism and the emergence of, the Islamic State and the civil war in Syria and everything that spread across the region, including in North Africa, in Libya, in Tunisia, in Algeria, and so on. And it became quite natural because I had an interest in conflict in general, in geography and many other kind of subtopics. So on that road, I kind of niched myself by starting to follow more closely the conflicts and the insurgencies that erupted in some of these countries. And eventually, North Africa was really my initial focus, even though I had the original idea to cover the whole of MENA. But I also thought it was beneficial to kind of have a more narrow scope instead of being like omnipresent. And on that way, the focus became more niched on a specific set of countries in North Africa, but soon also in the Sahel region. Because I was always intrigued by the Sahel due to the, cultural or relative cultural proximity, especially, between North Africa and the northern parts of those countries. Mm-hmm. And on that way, I kind of accumulated some knowledge and started to learn more about the region.
Yeah.
And it's really on that road that I ended up doing what I do.
All right. And when was that when you pivoted towards more Sahel coverage?
I mean, it was quite simultaneous because, my interest had dated far more back than when I, started focusing or specializing in the Sahel region. But still, it was pretty much at the same time around 2015 something.
So you set up Menastream, you continue, and then I remember that you and I met for the first time in 2019. And what was the progression like from starting as a hobby, getting more into it, becoming respected by researchers and analysts around to, make a decent living as you're doing right now?
Yeah, it was a quite slow process, I would say. It wasn't like I started doing what I do and overnight everything, went great like a rocket on NASDAQ or something. It was really not like that. So it was a lot of, free work for several years, just, building the trademark, credibility, and so on. And simply on the road, just, learning, what I was researching myself. So when we met in 2019, my company wasn't doing very well. It was more like a placeholder, mm-hmm. For what was to come. But anyways, in the past few years, ever since, things have really, really progressed.
Yeah. What do you think was the catalyst to that?
Yeah, first of all, when I started doing this, I also began, you build your own network and mm-hmm. you have the privilege to really, connect this with some really clever people. And some of those, they also kind of, promoted the stuff that I posted and provided opportunities. I started writing some blog posts and guest posts here and there. And on that road, I kind of, built a name in some way. And after that, the opportunities started to show up. But the social media or Twitter was really kind of, the entry port for what I was doing.
So now you're focused on the Sahel. You do a lot of research. You're part of different projects focusing on different elements within the Sahel, from arms trafficking to terrorism, to general security and geopolitics. So if we look a wide lens, so if we start with, where do you think the Sahel, I know it's multiple countries, but overall, what do you think are the biggest challenges at the moment for the Sahel?
Yeah, it's really difficult to be optimistic when following or observing the trends, the prevailing trends that we have seen in the past couple of years, because they are really marked by a continuous escalation of conflict. Measured by all metrics, so to speak. So the number of attacks, armed actors, proliferating, number of deaths, conflict-related deaths, they are, continuously increasing. And also, like, the trajectory in certain countries, I would say Mali and Burkina Faso as well are of major concern. Regarding how things are developing there. And yeah, so it's really hard to see that things will, change in a positive way in the near future. And this relates both to the growth and the expansion of militant groups, including the Al-Qaeda affiliated Jama Nusratul Islam al-Muslimin, but also Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which was designated a distinct province early this year. And with the withdrawal of France from Mali in mid-2022, they really left a security vacuum behind themselves. And this was clearly exploited by Islamic State, which initially didn't have that same kind of territorial control, but coinciding with the French withdrawal, they launched this major offensive of an really unprecedented scale. And I mean, more than 1,000 people were killed, even according to moderate estimates. The majority of them were civilians, but also, militiamen from local groups like the MSA and Gatia, but also rival jihadis from Jenin. And not only by consolidating, control of Menaka and Gao, but more broadly in the Liptako-Gourma or the three-state border area, they also began gradually trying to develop some form of pseudo-state by beginning to engage in more kinds of governance activities. And that was really a change that came with the designation as a province. But I mean, it doesn't only relate to the Islamic State that, the political stability throughout the region has, been quite poor due to the takeovers by, military juntas. There are, significant democratic backsliding. And, due to that, I would say that the states with their current transition governments have really opted for a kind of full war approach, which by itself entails an escalation. And you only don't have the issue with the insurgents or the jihadis. You also have, this issue between, for instance, in Mali, Bamako and former Tuareg rebels with growing tensions that could bring us back to a similar situation as in 2012 when the conflict really erupted.
At the moment, you see this escalation of violence. And there's something that you and I spoke about earlier this week and I think we spoke about this before, 2022, particularly in Mali saw, I don't know if it's Burkina Faso the same, but Mali saw the highest or the deadliest year recorded. And much of that was through government hands. I mean, how do you think that happened? Why do you think that trend appeared?
I mean, first of all, it was the deadliest year since the onset of the conflict. But it was also the first time that, the Malian armed forces became the deadliest actor. And this is based on not only the number of civilians they killed, which, totaled more than the combined number of the previous decade.
Wow.
And we are speaking about what is reported.
Yeah.
At the same time, the Malian armed forces also killed more militants, reportedly, than the total of the previous decade combined.
Okay.
The thing is that, a large fraction of these reported fatalities comes from Malian authorities' communications alone. So those are largely, single-sourced claims by the government in their, weekly and bi-weekly reports. So, I mean, you really need to caveat that because they have an interest in portraying their counterterrorism operations as a success for their popular base. And therefore, you really have to consider those potential biases. At the same time, it should be noted that this development really kind of coincides with the arrival of what the Malian authorities describe as Russian instructors. But I mean, in the international community, most people agree that those so-called Russian instructors are mercenaries from the private military company, the Wagner Group.
Yeah.
And they have really enabled this return from certain areas from where the Malian armed forces had largely disengaged or withdrawn in the previous years. So one could say, if we're going to be frank, that this return has been extremely violent. And I think that is clearly reflected by the civilian fatalities from these military operations, which in many cases have been extremely indiscriminate. And while Fulani the Fulani community has borne the brunt of these military operations, we also see that other communities are also affected. So even if the Fulani community mostly throughout the conflict has been extremely kind of stigmatized and, viewed as complicit with militant groups due to both kind of perceived or real links. And this is something that goes back to, in the wake of the Tuareg rebellion. Mm-hmm. Because when, the MNLA started, their operations, the Fulani, they joined, jihadi groups for protection. And even ever since, because that they did that, they gained this kind of, they became like stigmatized in that regard and perceived as a community susceptible to, jihadi recruitment. But that is also due to kind of their own history of, the jihads, the Fula jihads of the 18th and 19th century, which is obviously very different from today's modern guerrillas or, the insurgencies that we see throughout, Africa and Middle East. But all this combined and that they, by kind of ancestry and heritage, are, predominantly Muslim and, also inhabit many of these kind of border areas in the region where, militant groups have achieved a certain degree of control and strong influence.
Just to play the devil's advocate here, the arrival of Wagner and the arrival of more heavy weaponry and different aerial platforms, and as you said, operations in areas that historically the government has pulled out from, doesn't it make sense? It's more deadly because there's more operational tempo, or does that not hold water?
No, I think this is completely correct because, the operations are usually spearheaded by helicopter, air landing operations and airstrikes that have increased substantially and even more when compared to, previous operations that were mostly ground operations because the Malians really didn't have those capacities. At the same time, it also brings us back to the question why countries like Mali decided to partner with Russia in the first place. Because, France have been in the Sahel for a decade and have been conducting quite broad-based counter-terrorism operations, but still the situation have only continued to deteriorate over this time. And while France has been engaging in both numerous of airstrikes and large-scale military operations and so on, it really comes down to this kind of collective failure of, in an effective way, containing the conflict. And populations in countries like Burkina Faso and Mali, they really didn't see the utility of France as they had been present for so long time, but they couldn't observe any improvement of the security situation. And secondly, France and other countries, including the US, they have been very kind of reluctant on providing the means that, Sahelian governments themselves want. Because, I don't think they want to be dependent. They want to have those means to be able to conduct their own operations more independently. And Russia has really provided that through the, acquisition of, aircrafts and helicopters. And with Wagner as this kind of policy tool, it also brings another component to the package provided by Russia, which is, greater firepower on the ground and different kind of intelligence gathering capabilities, that maybe the local forces weren't as efficient in doing. But still, at the center of, Wagner's tactics is really coercion. So I think it needs to be said that they are very efficient in killing, because they do. And I mean, all the numbers and the reported fatalities, as I already mentioned, points in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
But is this efficiency of killing people meaningful for counterinsurgency? That is highly debatable.
Yeah, it's very difficult, because this is a problem, obviously, that many countries across the Sahel, as well as in other parts in the Horn and DRC and Mozambique have, where, they don't have the firepower, because most of these countries have arms embargoes placed upon them by the UN Security Council. And, well, Russia doesn't really acquiesce to that. So where do you see the trajectory of Burkina Faso? And I know that's the country that you follow most closely.
Yeah, I would say that I follow Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger at pretty similar levels.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it's correct that Burkina Faso, especially in the context of, Russia's, spreading or growing influence, and also the possibility of, future Wagner deployments, Burkina Faso has really been, a target of such a potential employment of Wagner. And I mean, there were so many kind of converging factors that pointed in that direction. But I mean, it's still to be seen whether that will happen. But I mean, considering the difficulties that Burkina Faso is in, and after 2 successive coups, I mean, the likelihood is that President Ibrahim Traore might take such a turn, not only because the major challenges he's facing. I mean, just in the past days, we have seen reports of dozens of Burkinabe soldiers being killed in the far north of the country in successive attacks attributed to the Islamic State. And I mean, this is only a few months into his tenure. And considering what happened to his predecessor, Damiba, it cannot be excluded that he will, meet the same fate. So as, the initial strategy that he adopted to let the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, or the VDP, to play a more, central role in his counterinsurgency strategy, I mean, I think we already have seen some of the limits, even though, I mean, we have to be honest that it's difficult to kind of really evaluate success just a few months into, his reign, as he took over, the country in late September. But still, I think there are limits for what the VDP can achieve. And we have also seen this growing trend of civilian targeting by government forces in Burkina Faso, but also by, militant groups such as JNIM and IS Sahel. And due to that, it really is the continuation of this escalation that I already mentioned earlier. And I mean, if his strategy will fail, it could be that he really chooses the option of Wagner to kind of try to turn the tide more in his favor, and also kind of to protect himself.
Yeah. And which I think a lot of Wagner experts would agree that that's being Wagner's like predominantly reason for them to exist, to ensure governments don't fall. I mean, that's what they were there for in Syria. That's what they were there for in Libya, which it didn't work out that way that they wanted. But in CAR, it did, right? So if we move towards Niger, where the dynamic is a bit different, I mean, I don't see Wagner going into Niger anytime soon. However, they might look at their neighbors and say, well, we are able to do more? Or do you think that France is, and maybe the rest of the international community is tighter in the seat there?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we need to get back to the previous passage regarding that Wagner is like trying to prevent governments from falling. I think it's more about that their business model is to kind of intervene and provide their services in failed states.
Yeah,
because that's really how I view it, at least, you know, with the cases that we have seen. I mean,
I agree with you on that.
Not that all countries are failed states, because I mean, there are very kind of local and strong differences between the countries where they have intervened. But still, it includes Syria, Libya, Mali, Mozambique, and they have also, you know, getting a foothold in other countries
like Sudan,
like Sudan, and also Cameroon and so forth. Yeah. So to begin with, I think that is a quite, you know, important point to underscore. As for Niger, the situation is really different. At the same time, which is quite astonishing, is that Niger, in comparison to neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso, is facing so many different kind of threats. So you have like already, you know, Libya, which was extremely destabilized in the wake of the fall of the Gaddafi regime. They have the Boko Haram insurgency in the southeast of the country, with the Difa region mostly affected. At the same time, they have their, you know, southern border with Zamfara and Sokoto in Nigeria, where this kind of criminal insurgency driven by bandit gangs is both spilling over into Niger's Maradi region. That is not to say that there isn't, you know, like very kind of domestic dynamics feeding into this, because I think there really is. Still, what is happening in Maradi and along the border with Nigeria is quite murky, because, you know, there is very little information about the specific groups or those, you know, engaging in the violence there. They are, you know, really attributed by this catch-all term armed bandits, but not very kind of granular when it comes to really who they are. At the same time, you have Islamic State, which is really the dominant non-state actor across Tillaberi region and also in parts of Tawa. While in southwestern Tillaberi on the border with Burkina Faso, there you have JNIM, which is the dominant actor. And based on all this combined, you can see that Niger is really facing a quite significant host of threats. While it isn't really as complex in Burkina Faso, even though Burkina Faso have been much more overrun compared to Niger, and the same in Mali.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with the geography of Niger, but also that Niger historically has taken a quite different approach to militancy and rebellions in general. They have been historically more open to dialogue and have, you know, certain channels of communication open to different armed groups. So I think that has been beneficial. But at the same time, you have this issue across the G5 Sahel, the various countries. It is really about survival in many cases. So each country do the best they can to keep their own country as stable as possible. And sometimes that could have, you know, ramifications, you know, for foreign labor and vice versa. Even in Niger, it has often been dismissed that, you know, the insurgent problem is something that isn't really domestic, that it's something, you know, a kind of exogenous problem and spill over coming from neighboring countries. Like in the southeast, it is the Boko Haram insurgency, which certainly have roots in Nigeria. But I mean, the problem have really taken domestic proportions as well. And that is really the same thing in in the northwest, in the Tillabéri region, because I mean, even when we looked at the recent offensive in Gao and Menaka region in Mali, it was really staged in some areas of Niger. So sometimes, a country can have this kind of hands-off approach, just to have, a certain kind of calm, in their own border areas, but it could be detrimental to the neighbor. But also at the same time, you have a very kind of weak presence of the Malian government forces in parts like Gao and Menaka. So that kind of have also hit Niger numerous times, because there are so many attacks that were staged in Mali that happened in the northern parts of Tillabéri and vice versa. So it's really a sort of vicious circle of insecurity and just, weakness more in general, and inability and a lack of capacity to really coordinate actions to confront the mutual kind of threats that these countries are facing. And I think this has been very clear in the case of the G5 Sahel force, even though there have been some issues related to the lack of funding to conduct operations, but eventually due to the political instability in certain countries, this kind of, regional coalition basically broke down after being glued together and spearheaded by France for several years. But it's still kind of, indicative of the lack of will and ability to really pull resources and coordinate actions together.
Interesting. I mean, I think we're kind of like moving a sliding scale from violent to maybe less violent. What is your stance, even though you might not follow with this as well, on Chad?
Yeah, Chad. I mean, it's really not my area of expertise, but I mean, we have seen that one issue when it comes to Chad is that France have a very kind of different approach when it comes to the military takeover or, the succession of President Deby following his death. And also like France intervening to protect regimes that face threats that are not necessarily terrorist, and which is really outside of the scope of, what was intended with, for instance, Operation Barkhane, when they conducted airstrikes against rebels, coming from Libya in the north of the country. And, this kind of different measures or treatment of various regimes, it has questioned really France's objectives and interests in dealing very differently with various regimes. So, I mean, Chad has received a very kind of a much more favorable treatment in that regard.
So again, to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, isn't that because France is very dependent on Chad and maybe a little bit less so Niger because of uranium supplies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know really, because there are so many other places where they can get hold of uranium. And you have even seen in the case of Niger that they are basically dismantling operations in the north of Agadez, where they had these uranium mines in Arlit. So I'm not sure if that dependency explains, I mean, the uranium dependency can explain that, but they have a long history in Chad that, predates even, President Deby and goes far back. I mean, there are other people that are in a much better position than I to answer any questions related to Chad. But I mean, they have an interest because they're, center of, operations or logistic hub is in N'Djamena. So, I mean, I think that makes Chad an important country for them to maintain a presence. At the same time, they have really kind of restructured or kind of made Niger as their central hub now of counter-terrorism operations, but still, even Niger finds itself in a somewhat, fragile position because there are similar sentiments and very strong anti-French sentiments there, similar to in neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso. But still, I think the Nigerians have been kind of better in maintaining and really dealing with these issues and, framing France's role as beneficial to them.
Yeah. And I mean, I've written about Chad, so I'm semi understanding of the dynamics there. And obviously, France has supported for decades, leaders and supported takeovers for decades and didn't really say anything when there was democratic backsliding in Chad, right? So that is interesting and some would say hypocritical.
Exactly.
And obviously there's another element where the rebels, which is the family of the current president, is allegedly supported by Qatar. I mean, I think that's where they are physically. And I think under the former regime in Sudan, they got support there. So obviously there are a lot of different dynamics and different proxies and all that kind of stuff. What I find fascinating, and I think me and you have spoken about this before, is in all this like sea of chaos, and I'm just, being very liberal with the word chaos because it's relative. Obviously, if you live there and you see it from the outside, you only get the negative news. People push back at me and say, well, you're carrying a narrative of making it worse than it is. No, I only focus on something that I understand, which is, security. But how come that, and I know this is not one of the countries that you follow as closely, but how come that Mauritania remains relatively unscathed from insurgencies, terrorist attacks, and the instability that we see in the neighboring countries or in the G5 Sahel at large?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are numerous explanations and also things that are very kind of difficult to decipher or to know whether it's true or not. For instance, to begin with, Mauritania has taken a quite different approach to militancy in general. They have been more like accommodating, more open to dialogue. They have had this, program, including, providing amnesty to people who had engaged in, violence in Mali or even in the country itself. So they have been more, very much more open to dialogue and to find this kind of endogenous solution to the problem. At the same time, again, you can also see quite clearly that they haven't been really at the forefront in the fight against, militant groups, for instance, in Mali or in any other country in the region. So their own engagement has been extremely limited. And these rumors have existed for years. And there have been reports about, both tacit agreements and non-aggression pacts and so on. But I mean, I even think that, in between, I think the truth is somewhere in between, that, there is this possibility of, a tacit agreement. And I mean, it's nothing that I believe would be exceptional to Mauritania. I even think that could be the case in other countries as well. I mean, as we have seen, for instance, recently in the past few years that, militancy from the Sahel has expanded, more kind of southbound to the West African littoral states, including Benin, Togo, and Ghana, and Ivory Coast. But yeah, underlining that Ghana is the country which hasn't so far been affected at all, or at least there ain't no documented attacks that would that with certainty can be attributed to jihadi groups. So there are some indications that they have taken a similar kind of hands-off approach by, not being extremely or not aggressive at all, even though militant groups, use the northernmost border areas as, a safe haven in some way in order to kind of flee, jump border and conduct attacks in neighboring Burkina or in Togo or so on.
And I mean, this can happen naturally, right? That they do this and the Ghanaians, there is no problems. So maybe there doesn't have to be, and this is the same for Mauritania, there doesn't have to be a tacit agreement or any agreement at all, right? It can be that, yes, maybe it's used as a launching pad, but they don't engage in activities in Ghana. So maybe the Ghanaians feel like, hey, why would we push this, right? And so there doesn't have to be any communication between a group like JNIM or Sahel to a government and say, hey, let's sit on a table, right? It can be that, hey, we're not doing anything, so you don't do anything without speaking.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly. But I mean, that is basically what a tacit agreement is. They have, the militants themselves, they have an interest in securing logistics flow, freedom of movement, and so on. And for that reason, they don't have an interest in attacking those countries because they need these points of, withdrawal.
Yeah.
And for that reason, they play cool and don't disturb, their hosts. For that reason, they are in turn not attacked as well.
Yeah. Very interesting. And where do you see the UN mission or the UN missions, the one in Mali and Niger?
Yeah, I mean, this obviously concerns primarily Mali. And to begin with, there's been a lot of obstruction when it comes to the MINUSMA peacekeeping mission ever since France's withdrawal. I mean, this concerns, denial of, access to airspace, quite significant to the point that, as I see it or as I understand it, that the UN mission has difficulties in, providing necessary security and intelligence even for their own security and their convoys. And this poses a real problem when they are faced with, this type of obstruction, and really calls into question, the viability of the mission and whether they need to kind of change the whole focus of the mission. And clearly there are some indications that the Malian themselves, it's not necessary that they don't want MINUSMA there, but they want to see them in a very different role and capacity, more as a counter-terrorism ally instead of, the things that are integral parts of their mandate, including, monitoring human rights violations or, breaches of the Algiers peace agreement and so on.
So they want to see a more active UN.
Yeah, they want a more active UN that basically becomes a sort of force multiplier that provide, the Malians with what they need to conduct their counterterrorism operations, whether it be medevacs or whatever, but not in the capacity of monitoring the potential bad things that the Malians are doing on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, there has been multiple countries that left the MINUSMA mission. Where does the US stand in all this?
Well, this is a very good question. So, I mean, the US, I believe they have been, very engaged on multiple levels, but still prefer this kind of, role more, not so obvious, and like having this very light footprint. They do, provide ISR to local forces. We can observe some form of, supervision even in terms of some of the large scale operations conducted bilaterally, including between the Burkinabés and the Nigerians as part of Operation Tanli, which is this joint operation conducted between Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso along their shared border, where there were some, U.S. involvement, especially in a more kind of supervisory role. And I mean, they have their bases, they are conducting, training and all that, but not really engaged in the way of having boots on the ground. And they have, kind of let France have that kind of responsibility and take that, more kind of primary role in that regard. And I mean, how the U.S. will engage in the future, it's really not something that I can, respond to. I'm not really in that position. But I mean, there's been calls for U.S. engagement to be more like focused on, development and less on counterterrorism or, as a continuation of the war on terror. And I mean, I think the U.S. doesn't have the same legacy as France. So for that reason, they are in a much better position than France to kind of, use their leverage, whether it comes to, providing support for rejuvenated democracy or development or like assisting in other, ways that could be beneficial for these countries, whether it's to kind of support, dialogue or something with armed groups, even though that has always been quite taboo in the US as well. But I think they really have that leverage and can use it in a meaningful way to kind of possibly improve the situation.
Yeah. No, I think you're 100% right. I think that these calls have been made for a long time. I mean, the Chinese have taken that approach to go for more development and projects and direct foreign investment. And you make an interesting point there where you say that they don't have the same legacy as France. So that definitely makes sense. And I hope, the US re-engages Africa more. And you are seeing it, but it's mainly around critical minerals and countering Russia and Chinese influence. I don't know if that's necessarily beneficial for host nations or locals. Héni, I mean, I think we can talk for hours and hours about the Sahel. In short, in the next 12 months, what if you have to make an insight or maybe not a prediction, but assessment on what do you, I think you did it in the beginning a little bit already. Where do you think we're going in the Sahel? What will we see more or less of?
I mean, I really think it's sad to say it, but it's pretty clear that I presume that we will see a lot more violence and conflict. And at the same time, there are things that could happen, but we really don't know yet, especially with regard to Mali and the tensions ongoing between Bamako and Kidal, which I view as a major source of concern because, I mean, the challenges are already so significant that if we would see, another kind of sub-conflict being triggered once again, it would be extremely, both destabilizing and fragilizing for not only Mali, but for the sub-region. Mm-hmm. But more generally, I think that we will continue to see what we see. And that is, an escalation where countries, especially Mali and Burkina Faso, are continuing to pursue this kind of total war approach that has been ongoing, in the past year in Mali and more recently since President Ibrahim Traoré took power in Burkina Faso and the, acceleration of the VDP program, which I think, and I mean, it's pretty clear that we observe it, as we have seen already in the past few months, that, not only is the state violence increasing, the state sanctioned violence increasing, and that is to say what these self-defense groups or militias are doing, but consequently, you also see that the jihadi groups, they are responding to, popular mobilization, or as in the case of Mali, they now see the Russian Wagner mercenaries as a force that basically have replaced France, and they try to use it as a sort of enemy to kind of mobilize around and really exploit and use the victimization of the local population in their propaganda. And I mean, along that line, and also the competition between JNIM and Islamic State, it's also kind of something that not necessarily is anything good, which many people believe in the first place when, the conflict broke out between the two groups, that it would be beneficial for counterterrorism that these two rival or competing jihadi groups would fight each other. Instead, what it has generated is more like renewed mobilization within or to these groups, in the respective kind of areas of influence. And I think that we are now seeing, how this is evolving and, the kind of sort of fallout from those developments.
All right. It was very worrying assessments that you made there. If I had to look deep into the future, it would be an interesting case if the situation gets flipped and if the violence gets more and it becomes more brutal, that all of a sudden, the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend and certain groups get support from the West. Obviously, that's very far looking into the future. If Russia is a common enemy through Wagner. I don't know what your opinion on that is, but that's just me just throwing a wild card scenario in there. I want to ask you, and I asked this to all my guests, my esteemed guests. I mean, you had a very interesting journey into this field. First question I want to ask you is, would you recommend to take the path that you did? And secondly, if anything, what would you recommend somebody that's looking into what you're doing as a researcher, as an analyst, and what advice would you give them?
I mean, I think there are some living examples already, and I mean, it's really kind of heartwarming when someone tells you that they were kind of inspired by looking at your own work, and like that factor in
amazing
them kind of, engaging and beginning their own journeys. And I'm not going to mention any names, but that's something that I have heard from people that I even, have at times, worked and collaborated with in various capacity, but also kind of really nice to see that their own journeys were much more like accelerated compared to my own, because I mean, they had very specific and useful skills that enabled them, to kind of do what they do in a very successful way. So, I mean, if you are interested in what you are doing, there really is no limit, but at the same time, it demands, a lot of work, engagement, and interest in what you do. Because, I mean, it's like with everything, if you don't really burn for what you do, the possibility for success will be extremely limited.
So passion is important.
Yeah, definitely.
And more skill-wise, what advice would you give for people to learn, to teach themselves or learn through school or courses?
Yeah, I mean, there is such a wide, field and many different specialties that you can focus on or or niches and so on. But I think some kind of originality is always necessary, because you really need to kind of stand out in some way. And this can be done in various ways, but, to kind of really try and specialize in something specific, even though it has both, pros and cons. Some people, they try to kind of be like these omnipresent, conflict observers that, follow everything that happens across the world. But for me, I think it's more beneficial to kind of have a more narrowed focus and really kind of try and learn as good as you can the specific field that you're interested in work on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that social media push is addictive, right? That dopamine hit of likes, shares, and comments and compliments. So I think it's important for people to understand what is real and what is not. And I think I am, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, I am, from the moment that we met in person, you are one of the few people in this like online researcher, analyst world that I know in person. And from, the conversations we've been having over the years, I can say that I'm incredibly proud of your progress and where you are today. And people that know me and young people, old people that I've spoken with, I always point you as how it should be done or how it could be done, and that you're a great example for people. I hope I don't blow up your Twitter account and your DMs too much by me saying this for people asking you for advice, but I think it's a badge of honor that you get these comments, as you said, and people say that. I think for me and for Great Dynamics at large, I'm super happy that people are inspired with what we do. But I can genuinely say, I'm super happy with where you are, and it really warms my heart. I'm not saying this for the podcast. I feel this way, that I'm really happy, what you've been doing, and people don't know, what you and I know, but against all odds that you have done it. And, maybe in the future we can talk about that. But yeah, again, incredible job. I know you're busy as hell, and it was hard for me just to get you on this podcast. But I want to ask you, first of all, do you have any questions for me?
I mean, not really. I would like to add that, first of all, it's extremely flattering, and I'm not sure if I deserve all the kind words that you
are. You do. Yeah, you do.
Flooding me with. But for me, most of all, having the privilege to work with something that is extremely kind of, fascinating, intriguing, and interesting in many ways. It's something that I really enjoy. But I would even say that the real bonus and the biggest benefit that I have, from working in this field is really so many, excellent minds and like at all levels, the amazing people that I have had the privilege also to get to know. And some of them are really people that I perceive as, or I view as, friends for life, really. So, that is something that has brought many positive things on my end in this whole kind of experience, if I put it that way.
So I go back to you. Do you have a question for me or anything, really?
No, I really don't. Right. So if you want to ask me something else, feel free.
Yeah. I'm gonna. It's just that's one question that I've started asking in this podcast. As I said, I know you're a busy guy, but at the end of every podcast, I ask people, what are they reading? What are they listening to? What are they watching? So is there something? And please give me an answer, because I don't want to hear I'm too busy. I'm a family man. There must be something, even if it's nothing to do with what we do. Maybe you like reality shows. I don't care. But is there something that you do or you engage or you can advise people to have a look at just for fun of it?
Yeah, this is a really tricky question, because I'm really kind of the average guy, Netflixing with my wife, in the spare time. And sometimes, as I say, like in solidarity, watching, reality shows, even, I mean, if I'm going to be completely unfiltered, like 90 Days Fiance and that kind of stuff. But I mean, it's all fun, and, you do the best of the time that you have, to spare and just,
absolutely,
and enjoy with your loved ones.
Oh, that's a great answer.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can say that is something that I recommend, but at least, it's what comes to mind when you ask that question.
Are you reading anything?
I mean, otherwise, I read a mixture of stuff, mostly related to, I mean, my line of work. And the latest book that I got hold of is the Mirage Sahelien by Héni Nsaibia. So, I mean, I could recommend that as some interesting reading.
Is that a French only book? Is it also in English?
Yeah, it is a book in French by journalist, researcher Héni Nsaibia. It's basically about, the whole French engagement in the Sahel from a I would say a kind of both objective and in some way a very kind of critical standpoint.
That we're gonna put that in the show notes then. Héni, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast. I know I had to convince you to come on, but I think it's very insightful. I think you're one of the few people that says it like it is, and I really appreciate your insights into our Sahel Security Week. And for people listening, if you made it this far, thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for all the comments. I hope you guys found this conversation as illuminating as I did. And if you want to know more about Héni, where can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm accessible on the Menastream, Twitter feed. So that is my Twitter handle, Menastream.
We will add that to the show notes too. So anybody that wants to look up your work, and that we will post that too. And I wanted to say something to the listeners too, is that we've been doing the Sahel Security Week. So if you're interested in it, go to greatdynamics.com. As I said in a previous podcast, we're trying to offer people insights into what analysts, researchers, journalists, investigators, academics do. And we try to give examples and we try to teach people. And our course is coming out, guys. So keep an eye out on the website. Become a member of the newsletter. And for all the podcast listeners, if you want to know more about what we do and you want insights, or you want to become part of our community, which we do vet. So just so you know, guys, if you do not pass the vetting, you cannot join. But for all podcast listeners, we offer a 20% discount for all the year subscriptions. So if you go to the website and you subscribe for a year, then you get 20% discount if you use the word podcast, all small letters. And guys, keep on listening and keep on following what we're doing. And again, Héni, thank you for subjecting yourself to this. And yeah,